He married her for a fresh start, but what he uncovered in her mansion wasn't just mystery. It was a haunting legacy that would change him forever. In 7 days, a poor cowboy learned the secret buried beneath silk sheets, canyon winds, and a woman with eyes like winter frost. What began as a desperate deal ended with a letter that made him saddle up one last time, for answers only found under an old willow tree. In 1889, the dust-covered town of Sagebrush Hollow stood quiet and weathered under an endless sky, where buildings leaned like old secrets and cowboys like Colt Mercer chased cattle by day and ghosts by night. At 23, Colt was as lean as a fence post and twice as stubborn, a wanderer who'd bury his memories beneath hay bales behind any livery stable that would ignore his unpaid tab. He had once belonged to something. His father, Silas Mercer, owned a stretch of land north of town, fenced it before he had a single steer, and dreamed like the land would listen. But a flood wiped out the herd and the debt collectors came next, dragging Silas to the grave and Colt to the edge of ruin. Now he roamed from ranch to ranch, hands blistered, hat frayed, chasing wages that vanished like mirages. That's when it happened. Late one evening, while mending a busted gate at Hallow Creek Ranch, a silent rider approached on a cold, dark horse, dust clinging to his coat like shadow, and without a word handed Colt a sealed envelope with a scent of lavender and gun oil. Inside was a note: "Mr. Mercer, supper, dusk, Ironwood Range, come clean, come quiet." No name, no explanation, but Colt had heard of the Ironwood Range and the woman who ruled it like a storm. Madeline Ironwood, cattle baroness, widow, and legend whispered about in saloons and saddlebags. People said she hadn't been seen in town for 5 years, not since her last husband vanished without a trace. Colt didn't own a clean shirt, but he'd borrowed one, cleaned his boots with spit, and slicked his hair back like a man about to con a ghost. When he arrived, the ironwood gates rose before him. Black iron twisted into thorned branches with a coiled rattlesnake at the center. A ranch hand, silent and watchful, met him with a single word: "She's waiting." The house on the hill looked more like a courthouse than a home, marble floors echoing under Colt's boots, chandeliers flickering like stars caught in glass. When he entered the dining room, Madeline Ironwood sat at the far end of a long oak table polished so fine it caught fire from the candles. She wore a dark purple dress, silver buttons catching the light, and rings that glinted like knives. Her voice was steady and cold. "Mr. Mercer, you came." "Didn't feel like I had much choice," he replied, hat in hand. "Everyone has a choice," she said, pouring herself wine without offering him a drop. "You just might not like what happens if you say no." And then she said it, plain as a branding iron. "I need a husband, legal, immediate. 1 week. After that we part ways clean." Colt stared at her like she'd asked him to lasso the moon. "Why me?" he asked. Her answer was as sharp as the wine she sipped: "Because you're poor, decent, and forgettable." "Not sure if that's a compliment or an insult," he muttered. "Both," she said flatly. "Say yes, and you'll never owe another man again. Say no, and I'll send you off with leftovers and a broken chance." Colt wasn't a man who rushed decisions, but something about her tone, like a gun half-cocked under the table, told him this wasn't just about a name on a document. She needed someone close, and soon. He poured himself half a glass of that dark wine and raised it slow. "You got yourself a cowboy." She didn't smile, just nodded. And the next morning, as the sun cracked the sky open, Colt Mercer became her husband. No crowd, no kiss. Just a preacher who smelled of old whiskey, a few stone-faced ranch hands, and the creak of saddle leather in the still morning air. Madeline wore a black dress, veil drawn low, lace at the cuffs like funeral wrappings. Colt wore the same shirt he'd buried his father in. When the preacher asked if he took her as his wife, Colt looked at her, this storm in a dress, and said, "I do." Her answer was colder. "I suppose I must." And that was that. No rice, no rings, just signatures and silence. Colt moved into the Ironwood house like a man walking into a painting he didn't belong in. Silk sheets, hot meals, and corridors wide enough to lose yourself in. Madeline never joined him for breakfast. Each night she sat alone on the porch, with a glass of wine and a stack of old letters, disappearing into the locked room at the hall's end, like a ghost walking back into its grave. Colt asked her once what was behind the door, Her eyes, icy and distant, met his and said, "The part of me that still matters." He didn't ask again. But on the third night, a letter appeared under his door, unsigned. "You have 6 days left to know who she really is." And that's when the wind in the ironwood house began to whisper things he couldn't unhear. By the fourth morning, Colt Mercer woke to a silence that didn't belong, the kind that feels like a held breath right before a storm breaks. The breakfast tray sat outside his room as usual, bacon, eggs, cornbread still warm, but no footsteps echoed down the long hall, and the usual hush of servants had turned into something heavier, like the house itself had started listening. Colt dressed slower that day, boots creaking as he walked the halls, every painting on the wall seeming to tilt its gaze toward him, especially the portraits of dead-eyed men in grey uniforms and one of a woman in a black riding cloak whose face looked eerily familiar. Outside, the horses spooked as he approached, and the ranch hands muttered among themselves, never looking him square in the eye. Even Amos, the stablemaster, who usually grunted greetings, pulled him aside with a shake of his weathered head. "Last man who got curious about things he shouldn't sleeps under a rose patch out back," he said, voice like cracked leather. "Keep your questions quiet, son." Colt laughed, but the sound died in his throat. That evening, as the wind hissed through the floorboards, he waited until the house settled into its nighttime stillness and crept into the study, a room Madeline guarded like a vault. What he found on her desk was a journal, open, inviting, pages full of looping cursive that looked more like confessions than diary entries. He read until his eyes ached. One entry chilled his blood. "I was never meant to be loved again, only remembered. If you're reading this, I gave him the deal. He said yes, that means I have 7 days left." Colt snapped the journal shut just as footsteps creaked outside the door. He barely made it back to his room before Madeline's shadow passed beneath his doorframe. That night, he didn't sleep. By the 5th day, Colt was certain he wasn't the one observing this house. The house was watching him. Every door creaked differently, as if they each had their own language. The maids whispered in hallways and shut up quick when he passed. One even crossed herself. He tried to focus on work, checking fences, helping in the barn, anything to keep his hands busy. But everywhere he went, the ranch hands stared with the same expression, pity and warning. By late afternoon, he stood at the locked door at the end of the hall, the one Madeline disappeared into every night. He touched the iron handle, still warm. He knocked, just once. No answer. That night, there was no wine on the veranda, no stack of letters beside her chair. Madeline was nowhere to be seen. On the 6th day, Colt rode out alone past the range fences to the farthest canyon edge, trying to find a moment of peace, but even the land seemed haunted now. Wind whipped through dry branches, carrying voices he couldn't quite hear. When he returned, a folded piece of paper was waiting on his pillow, written in the same neat handwriting. 1 day left. Ask her the right question. Colt ate nothing that night. On the 7th day, dawn arrived like a secret being kept, hot, still, and thick with something unsaid. Madeline was gone. Her side of the bed was untouched. Her wineglass, still half full, sat on the porch railing. Every window in the house was open. The front door stood ajar, and the locked door, the one she never let anyone near, was wide open. Colt stepped inside. It was a room dressed in velvet and shadows, a museum of another life. An oil painting above the fireplace showed a younger Madeline smiling beside a man with fire in his eyes, both dressed for war and love. Beneath it, a trunk sat open. Inside were bundles of letters bound with twine, a wedding ring in a black velvet pouch, and a faded photograph of Madeline holding a baby. On top of it all lay a folded will, stamped and signed, leaving every acre, every coin, every horse and fence and building to Colt Mercer. Atop the will was one last letter. To my husband. Colt opened it, hands shaking. The words were quiet and final. If you're reading this, I've gone not far, just enough to make it easier. I didn't need a man, I needed a witness. Someone too poor to lie, too clean to be bought. I'm not just dying, Colt, I'm vanishing. They'll say I was mad, that I used you. Let them talk. You more than anyone know the truth now. Come find me if your heart is still clean. He saddled up without a second thought, the letter still clutched in his hand. Past the barn, past the fences, past the hills, and the canyons and the place she once pointed to from the porch and called where the earth remembers. And there she was beneath a weeping willow, blue dress fading, back resting against the trunk, a yellow flower in her lap. Madeline Ironwood looked up, pale but peaceful, and smiled through the tired in her bones. "You made it," she whispered. "Of course I did," Colt said, kneeling beside her. "You owe me answers." "No, Cowboy," she murmured, eyes softening. "I owe you peace." And with her final breath, she gave it. 3 weeks after Madeline Ironwood's final breath drifted across the canyon wind, Colt Mercer stood alone beneath the willow tree, a shovel in one hand and a silence in his chest that wouldn't break. There'd been no preacher this time, no ranch hand standing still, no final words read aloud, just earth and grief and a cowboy too young to carry this kind of history. He buried her with care, smoothed the dirt with his palms, and marked the grave with a simple wooden cross he carved himself. No inscription, no date, just a place where the past could sleep. Back at Ironwood Ranch, the world looked the same, but everything had changed. The staff didn't ask questions, not even when he returned alone, covered in sweat and dust, with eyes like thunderclouds. They bowed their heads when he passed, not out of fear or duty, but reverence, because somehow they knew what she'd given him and what she'd taken with her. Colt moved through the mansion differently now. He walked like he belonged, but carried himself like a man who'd inherited a ghost. He cleaned her study himself, every letter, every journal, every artifact she left behind. He read every page, absorbed her memories like water into dry soil. And somewhere between the ink and the silence he understood, Madeline had never been building an empire. She had been building a graveyard of secrets. She married him because she didn't trust anyone else with the truth, and because he reminded her of a time before she had to become Iron and Thorns. With the will official, Colt inherited the entire Ironwood estate, but money was the last thing on his mind. Instead, he walked the ranch, met every worker by name, asked what they needed, and listened. He doubled the wages of every hand, gave the maids rest days and new shoes, and for the first time laughter found its way into the halls of the Ironwood house. He fixed the bunkhouse, opened it up to boys too young and too tired from the railroad. Camps, kids who'd been working since their baby teeth fell out. Colt gave them beds, hot meals, and something they'd never had before, kindness without strings. And then he did something no one expected. He rode into town, straight to the mayor's office, and bought the land at the center of Sagebrush, Hollow. 2 weeks later the town watched as hammers swung, bricks laid, windows lifted, and a red schoolhouse with white shutters and a bell tower rose from the dirt. When it was done, he carved the name himself, the Madeline Ironwood School for Frontier Youth. The first day of class, Colt Mercer stood at the front of a room full of squirming, dusty kids, some too shy to speak, others too wild to sit. He taught them numbers, history, the names of stars, and how to ride a horse with dignity. He taught them the difference between being strong and being cruel, and he made sure they knew that just because the world was hard didn't mean they had to be. Every night, he wrote lessons by candlelight, pausing only when the wind changed, because sometimes it carried her scent, lavender and gun oil, and sometimes he swore he heard her voice reading the letters she never sent. And when the days turned long and the shadows reached over the canyons, Colt would saddle up and ride alone to the willow tree. He'd sit beside her grave, tip his hat, and talk. He'd tell her about the new students, about Amos fixing the stable roof, about sunrise that morning. Sometimes he asked questions she'd never answer. Other times he just sat in silence because she had taught him that not all truths needed to be spoken to be known. The townsfolk had opinions. Always. Did. Some said Colt tricked her, that he was a con man with good boots. Others whispered that she was mad, that she left everything to a stranger because she'd finally snapped. But most, deep down, knew better. They saw the way he looked at her name on the schoolhouse plaque, the way he watched the wind when it passed through the ranch like it still belonged to her. They watched as he turned a fortress of loneliness into a place of hope. No one had expected Colt Mercer to become the keeper of her legacy, not even him. And yet there he was, teaching children to read, leading cattle drives and tending roses behind the barn. He didn't do it for praise. He did it because something in her had trusted something in him. He didn't want her land. He wanted her peace. And maybe, just maybe, in every laugh that echoed through the bunkhouse and every bell that rang sharp at 7 a.m., he was finding it. By the time the first snowfall kissed the canyon ridges, The Ironwood Ranch had become something no one could have predicted. A sanctuary, not just for cattle and crops, but for souls that had nowhere else to go. Colt Mercer stood at the center of it all, not as a cowboy, not as a husband, but as a bridge between what Madeline Ironwood had built and what she had buried. He moved through the house like a man chasing ghosts, but not to banish them, to understand them. He began sorting through the journals she left behind, each one a glimpse into a mind both brilliant and broken. Some pages were lists of names, men she had outbid, women she had helped in silence, children she sponsored through faraway schools under false aliases. Others were personal, grief-laced memories of lovers lost in wars, a brother who vanished in Missouri, and dreams of a child she once cradled in a fevered night, swearing he would never know her sins. And always, tucked between the lines, were questions she must have asked herself nightly. Can strength and softness live in the same soul? Can a woman like me ever be remembered without fear? Colt read until his eyes stung and sleep stole his body from the chair, waking only when the morning sun poured gold through the curtains. Outside, the town had started to change too. Parents, once hardened by drought and dust, now brought their children to the red schoolhouse with shy hope in their eyes. The saloon owner donated chairs for the classroom. The blacksmith sharpened pencils between horseshoes. A community was being stitched together quietly, thread by thread, and Colt never asked for thanks. He rode fence lines every morning like his daddy taught him, fixed broken gates himself, and never missed a day ringing the bell at the schoolhouse. But some nights the quiet got too loud. He'd find himself on the porch, wine glass untouched, beside him, listening to the wind whisper through the pines like it had something important to say. He didn't drink much, not anymore, not since he'd realized the wine was less about taste and more about remembering. And he didn't lock any doors in the house, not even hers. Every room stayed open, filled with light and dust and whatever. Peace could live there. But it was the room at the end of the hall, the velvet-shrouded one where it had all started, that still stopped him sometimes. He never moved the trunk, never took down the portrait. He just stood there when the moonlight hit right and let her story wrap around him like a shawl woven from thorns and love. One evening, as Colt returned from the canyon, he found something odd. A girl no older than 16 sat on the fence post with a burlap sack at her feet and bruises blooming like violets on her forearms. Her name was Willa. She'd run from a mining camp 2 counties over, said her stepfather drank too hard and worked her too long. Colt didn't ask more. He just gave her a bed in the old maid's quarters and said she could help in the kitchen until she figured out what came next. The other kids accepted her instantly. Willa could ride, shoot, and curse better than most grown men, but at night she wept quietly into her pillow. Colt noticed, but he never pushed. He knew healing came in its own time, like spring thaw in high country. Over the next month more arrived, 2 brothers with soot on their faces and no mother to call home. A boy with a limp and a stutter, but eyes sharp as barbed wire. They came not because Colt advertised, but because word spread the way truth always does, quietly through the right kind of people. And with each new arrival the ranch bent but never broke. The kitchen cooked bigger meals, the barn stayed warmer longer, and the halls echoed with the kind of joy Madeline had once believed she could never deserve. Still, Colt never stopped watching the horizon. He knew the world didn't change overnight, and peace always came with a price. There were men who didn't like what he was doing, ranchers who felt threatened, men in town who believed orphan kids and poor runaways didn't belong in classrooms. One even rode up to the schoolhouse drunk one afternoon, shouting slurs and threats. Colt stepped out, calm as ever, looked the man in the eyes and said, "If you're here to tear something down, you better know how to build what comes after." The man left without a word, and from that day forward no one questioned Colt Mercer's place in Sagebrush Hollow again, because by then he wasn't just the man who inherited Madeline Ironwood's land. He was the man who transformed her, legacy from something feared into something sacred. Spring came not with flowers, but with the soft rebellion of green cracking through the frost-bitten earth. And as life returned to Sagebrush Hollow, Colt Mercer found himself awakening too, not from sleep, but from the kind of emotional hibernation he hadn't known he'd slipped into. It happened slowly, like the thaw, as if Madeline's spirit had planted seeds inside the walls of the mansion, and now each laugh from a child, each footfall of a colt in the barn, was part of something bigger than survival. It wasn't just a school anymore. It was a living story, stitched with calloused hands and second chances, and Colt The man who'd once slept behind stables and borrowed shirts for suppers was now called Sir by boys who never had a father to look up to. But even as joy rose like morning mist over the land, shadows still lurked behind old traditions and tighter fists. One afternoon, Colt received a letter marked with the seal of the Hollow's wealthiest land baron, Cyrus Bramwell, a man whose handshake felt like a dare and whose influence ran deeper than the town's well. The letter, written in a polite sneer, invited Colt to a private meeting at Bramwell's estate. Against his better judgment, Colt went. The manor was all polished boots and velvet curtains, and Bramwell's study smelled of cigars and power. "Ironwood Ranch is a legacy," the old man said, eyes sharp as flint. "And legacy must be protected from sentiment." Colt stayed silent. "These orphans, these girls and boys with nowhere to go, this charity of yours, it makes others nervous." Colt leaned forward, voice even. "Good. Change should make men like you sweat." Bramwell chuckled, but his warning was clear. Slow down or face consequences. Colt rode back under a sky heavy with dusk and thought of Madeline, how she'd faced threats like Bramwell with wine and steel, and always alone. But Colt wasn't alone. Not anymore. That evening, he gathered the kids under the porch light, told them stories about real cowboys, ones who'd fought not with bullets, but with grit and heart. He looked at Willa, now 17, who'd started teaching the younger kids how to read in her spare time, her eyes less guarded with each passing day. He saw Tomas, the boy with the limp carving wooden animals for the others, and finally laughing without apology. He saw himself in all of them, pieces of a life once lost, now reborn in boots and books and soft goodnights. But even beauty can't outrun history, and trouble came one stormy evening when Colt returned from a supply run to find the barn door swinging open and the scent of kerosene in the air. A message was scrawled in soot across the wall. "Leave or burn." The fire hadn't caught thanks to rain, but the threat hung heavier than smoke. Colt said nothing the next day, just worked harder, tightened fences, reinforced the schoolhouse foundation, and kept teaching. But he didn't forget. He wrote it all down in a journal of his own, leather-bound and waiting for another soul to read it one day. He wrote about Madeline, about the marriage that began with a deal and ended in something like devotion. He wrote about the way grief can shape a man but shouldn't define him. And he wrote about love, quiet, stubborn love, the kind that didn't bloom with kisses or dances, but with trust and shared silence, the kind that builds schools instead of stealing hearts. The next time Colt sat by the willow tree, he didn't speak much. He simply placed his hand against the grave and whispered, "They're coming for what you left me, but I'm not afraid." That night, Willa knocked on his door. "I want to help more," she said, shoulders squared. "Teach, ride, fight if it comes to that." Colt looked at her, not as a girl rescued, but as a woman rising, and nodded. "Then we start tomorrow." Because he knew now. It was never about being ready. It was about choosing to stand when it mattered, and standing he would. The sun had just crested the canyon edge when Colt Mercer woke to the sound of hooves, many and fast, racing toward the ranch like thunder made of iron and anger. He was out the door before his boots were fully laced, shotgun slung across his shoulder, heart beating slow and steady like a war drum. Willa was already saddled up, rifle in hand, her eyes sharp and unwavering. The rest of the kids stood behind the porch, silent, clutching sticks and kitchen knives, pretending not to be scared, but shaking all the same. Colt raised a hand and they obeyed without question, because he'd earned their trust the hard way, with sweat, stories and kindness that didn't demand anything in return. The riders came into view, Bramwell's men, 6 of them dressed like lawmen but without a badge in sight, their coats flapping like flags of cowardice. The lead man, tall and sneering, dismounted and approached, chewing a toothpick like he was about to deliver scripture. "You've been warned," he said. "The old woman's land doesn't belong to a bunch of strays and a cowpoke with ideas." Colt stood tall, hands calm. "This land was given to me fair and legal. You want it? You'll have to take it from the ground up." The man chuckled, spit in the dirt. "That can be arranged." And with that, he tipped his hat and rode off. But the message had teeth. This wasn't over. That night, Colt sat at Madeline's desk, the firelight dancing across her journal, and he knew what he had to do. If Bramwell wanted a fight, he'd get one, but not with bullets, with truth. The next morning, Colt rode into town with a stack, of documents, copies of Madeline's will, journal entries, letters from the townsfolk praising the school. He stopped at every doorstep, every storefront, every post office and church, sharing the story piece by piece, not of his ownership, but of her intention, that the Ironwood Ranch be a place of healing, of learning, of redemption. And slowly, the tide turned. The saloon owner put up a sign, "We stand with the schoolhouse." The general store offered free supplies for students. Even the mayor, a man as slippery as rain on stone, gave a public statement. Let the boy teach. But Bramwell was not a man to back down. Days later, the sheriff, one of Bramwell's cousins, came with papers claiming the will was forged. Colt stood on the front steps of the schoolhouse and refused to be served. Madeline Ironwood lived with eyes wide open and a hand ready for war, he said loud enough for a growing crowd. If this is your play, make it. But know this, she chose me because she knew I wouldn't run. And that's when something remarkable happened. Willa stepped beside him, holding the school bell rope. "We won't run either," she said. Then rang at once, loud and true. Kids poured out of the building, lined up behind her, behind Colt, behind Madeline's dream. The sheriff backed down. That night the air was thick with relief, but still tinged with danger. Inside the mansion, Colt opened a letter he hadn't noticed before, tucked beneath the velvet lining of the trunk in her room. It was addressed, "To the man I took a chance on." It read, "Colt, if you're reading this, they've come for what they think is just land. But it's more than fences and cattle. It's forgiveness, it's memory, it's mine. Fight if you must, but never forget. The truth doesn't need a sword, it just needs someone willing to carry it through the fire." He read the words again and again, until they etched themselves into his bones. Then he tucked the letter into his coat, loaded the shotgun, and sat on the porch all night, just in case fire came in the form of kerosene and hate. But it didn't, because by morning there was something stronger than fear rising across Sagebrush Hollow: unity. And Colt Mercer knew then, this wasn't Madeline's ranch anymore. This was hers and his and theirs. A place not built by blood, but by belief. The morning after the standoff, Sagebrush Hollow woke to a strange silence, not the tense kind that followed danger, but the kind that signaled change, the quiet just before a community exhales and decides to stand taller than fear. Colt Mercer walked the ranch like a man reborn, boots sinking into thawing soil. The sunrise casting gold across the fields he now realized weren't just inherited, they were entrusted. The school bell rang crisp at 7 a.m., and kids filtered in like clockwork, chattering about math, ponies, and the strange joy of having warm cornbread at lunch. Inside the mansion, Willa was already boiling coffee, her hair tied back in a braid, her voice firmer now, no longer just a runaway, but a young woman who had found purpose in the ink-stained papers she graded each evening. Colt watched her sometimes, with a quiet pride, amazed by how the world had shaped her into someone Madeline herself might have admired. But peace was a borrowed thing in the West, and when a federal investigator arrived 2 weeks later, wearing a brown duster and a poker face, Colt wasn't surprised. "Just a formality," the man said, introducing himself as Agent Bellamy. "Review of the will. A few questions about Mrs. Ironwood's final days." Colt offered him tea, showed him the documents, and answered everything with steady honesty. But there was something about the agent's tone, too polite, too practiced, that kept Colt's gut twisted. Bellamy stayed in town for 3 days, speaking to ranch hands, shopkeepers, even riding out to the edge of the canyon where Madeline was buried. When he left, he said, "You're doing good work here, Mr. Mercer. Let's hope it stays clean." The words weren't a threat, but they weren't a blessing either. That night, Colt stood in the velvet room again, staring at Madeline's portrait. "Did you know they'd come this far?" he whispered. "Did you know you were leaving me the kind of inheritance that starts wars?" The fire crackled. The air didn't answer. But the next morning a letter arrived. No return address, just a folded piece of parchment sealed in black wax. "We know what you're hiding. We know what she buried." That sentence, just 7 words, hit Colt harder than a fist. He gathered every journal, every letter, reread them like a man hunting for a single line that could explain everything. That evening, Willa found him at the desk, surrounded by papers and shadows. "You all right?" she asked. "Just ghosts," he said, voice distant. "They're loud tonight." Willa placed a hand on his shoulder, gentle, steady. "Then let's talk to them." Together they combed through Madeline's past again until they found it. One journal entry dated 9. Years earlier nearly faded to nothing. If I die before the truth finds me, let the canyon hold it, not the grave, the vault. Colt's eyes narrowed. He had buried her near the willow tree, but the vault must have meant something else. That night, he rode out alone, lantern, swinging from his saddle until he reached the deepest part of the canyon. There, behind a fall of ivy-covered stone, he found it, a rusted iron door built into the rock itself, half hidden by time and erosion. It took him an hour to force it open. Inside was a room carved from stone, cold and silent, with only one thing inside, a wooden chest wrapped in chains. Colt broke them one by one, his heart pounding, and when he finally opened it, the truth stared back at him in the form of old deeds, forged marriage certificates, and ledgers showing Madeline's first fortune had come not from cattle, but from blackmail and blood. She had used information, secrets of powerful men, bribes, debts owed by names still etched on courthouse walls. Her empire had begun not with cattle, but with control. And the last paper inside was a letter, yellowed and brittle. I tried to undo it. I married you so the land could finally go to someone not cursed by it. If they find this, they'll come for you. But I believe you're strong enough to change what I never could. Colt sat in that stone vault for hours, the weight of history pressing on his chest like iron. Madeline had not been a villain, but she had not been innocent either. She had built an empire with fire and ash, and only in her last breath had she tried to plant flowers in the ruin. When he returned to the ranch, Willa was waiting, worry in her eyes. I found it, Colt said quietly. I found why they're coming. And she, without hesitation, asked the only question that mattered. What do we do now? Colt looked out toward the horizon where morning waited. We finish what she started, but we do it the right way. No secrets, no silence, no chains. Dawn broke over Sagebrush Hollow with a chill that didn't belong to spring, the kind of cold that whispers of reckoning. And as Colt Mercer stood outside the stone vault hidden deep in the canyon, he realized that inheriting Madeline Ironwood's world meant inheriting her choices too, both the noble and the damned. He rode back to the ranch with the chest of secrets tied behind his saddle, the weight of it not just in iron and paper, but in what it meant, that Madeline had built her, thrown not on land but leverage, names, affairs, blackmail, forged documents signed by men now in high office. And yet, even through all that rot, she had still chosen to leave it all to him, not to carry on the cycle but to break it. Inside the house, Willa met him at the door, her eyes scanning the box like it might bite. It's worse than I thought, Colt said, setting it on the table, but it's also our way out. They spent the day cataloging everything, mapping out connections, tracing lines between names and payments. By sunset, they had a complete picture of Madeline's shadow empire. But where others might have used it to hold power, Colt felt only shame. If I bury this again, I'm her, he told Willa, but if I open it up, I might burn everything she left behind. Willa crossed her arms, fierce as ever. Maybe it needs to burn, but we get to decide what grows in its place. Her words struck deep. That night, Colt wrote a letter, long and measured, and addressed it to Agent Bellamy. In it he explained everything, the vault, the ledgers, the evidence of how Madeline manipulated her rise. He attached copies, not the originals, and invited the agent back under peaceful terms. Then he sent a second letter to every name listed in the ledger, the men who had paid her, feared her, betrayed her. The message was clear. We know. We're not here to blackmail you. We're here to break the chain. Help us build something better, or stay buried with the old ways. The response came faster than expected. Within a week, 3 of the most powerful ranchers in the territory rode in together, their faces pale but their intentions firm. One brought a bag of gold to donate to the school. Another offered to deed a nearby field for expansion. The third simply said, "Tell no one what my father did. Let my children build their name without his shadow." Colt agreed, not out of fear, but because he understood now that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet mercy. Bellamy returned too, his face unreadable, and after walking the canyon vault himself, he made a call from the telegraph office that Colt didn't hear. But when he returned, the agent simply handed Colt a slip of paper. Investigation closed. Officially. Colt stood in the center of the ranch that evening, watching the children chase each other through the yard, their laughter rising above the hills like birds startled from the brush, and he finally exhaled. Madeline's sins had been aired, her empire dismantled, but her dream, her final trembling hope, that maybe something good could grow from all that ruin, was alive and moving in every child learning to read, every broken fence rebuilt with love, every moment where power was replaced by peace. That night, as the oil lamp flickered low, Willa knocked on his door with a small parcel wrapped in cloth. Inside was Madeline's wedding ring, the one she'd placed in the vault beside the photo of her holding a child. "Thought you might want to keep it," Willa said, voice quiet. Colt stared at the silver band, its surface dulled by time, but still gleaming in the firelight, and nodded. He didn't put it on. He didn't need to. He carried her already, in the land, the house, the fight. That same night he returned to the willow tree. It was late. The stars were wide and open, like eyes that didn't blink. He sat by her grave, set the ring in the earth beside her, and whispered, "I did it, Maddie. I gave them the truth, and they didn't run." The wind answered, soft and cool, rustling the leaves above him. "They stayed," he added, "and so will I." The summer came in waves of gold and sweat, and with it came growth, not just in the fields, but in the lives that now pulsed like heartbeat through the Ironwood Ranch. Colt Mercer, once a nameless cowboy scraping for a meal and a place to sleep, had become something more permanent than bloodlines or titles. He had become a root, something the land and people now relied on. The school doubled in size, thanks to the donated field and the hands that came willingly to raise walls and nail down roofs. Willa became a full-time teacher, her lessons bold and unflinching, mixing history with hard truths, grammar with grit. She stopped hiding her scars, physical or otherwise, and the girls in her class started walking straighter, speaking louder. Colt watched her proudly, often from the doorway, leaning just out of sight, a quiet guardian of the dream he'd helped inherit but chosen to shape. And each evening, when the sun dipped behind the hills, he still rode the fences, not because he had to, but because it grounded him, reminded him where he came from. His hands stayed rough, his shirt often sweat-soaked, and the ranch hands, once wary, now laughed with him, drank with him, asked for advice on how to raise their sons better than their fathers did. Amos, old and wise, started calling him boss with a grin instead of a grunt. The townsfolk changed too, less suspicion, more respect. One woman even came by with fresh pies each Sunday, swearing her daughter had never smiled until she started school at the red brick building with the iron-lettered sign. Colt never expected thanks, but it settled in his bones like a warm fire after a long winter. Still, there were days when the weight returned. He would find himself staring at Madeline's portrait in the velvet room, asking questions that had no answers. Why had she trusted him so quickly? Why him, of all people? But then he'd remember the note she left, someone poor enough to still believe in truth, and it made sense. He hadn't just been chosen because he was clean. He was chosen because he had nothing to lose, and chose to build something instead of burn it. Late one evening, he received a letter from one of the men in Madeline's ledger, the last one who hadn't responded. It wasn't a threat. It was a confession. He wrote of a deal made with her decades ago, how it had saved his family and ruined his sleep. He ended the letter with, "I hated her, until I realized she saved me from becoming my father. Thank you for not making me run from my truth." Colt folded the letter and placed it in Madeline's journal, then locked the vault in the canyon one last time. Some things, even when revealed, deserve to be buried with respect. That night he found himself on the porch again, the same one where Madeline used to sit with her wine and her silence. He poured a glass, let it breathe, then raised it to the stars. "We're not who we were," he whispered. "But maybe that's the point." Willa joined him not long after, 2 mugs of coffee in her hands instead. "Poured that wine for her again?" she asked with a smile. Colt nodded. She'd want it. She always liked watching the dusk. Willa sipped her drink, then said something that caught him off guard. "You ever think about settling down? Not just here, you settling?" He blinked. "You calling me restless?" She chuckled. "I'm saying even men with roots can keep digging for peace." Colt didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched the horizon quiet and then said, "Maybe peace ain't something you find. Maybe it's something you grow every day with the people who believe in you enough to stay Willa leaned back, her smile fading into something gentler. "Then you've got a whole orchard out there." And she was right. Because what Madeline had left behind wasn't just land, or money, or power. It was a place where broken people could rebuild, where forgotten souls could write their own names into the story. And Colt Mercer, the boy who once chased ghosts for wages, now stood at the center of it, not as a keeper of secrets, but as a guardian of new beginnings. Years passed like pages turned in a book, read slowly by firelight, and though the seasons changed, bringing drought, wind, celebration, and the inevitable hum of sorrow, the Ironwood Ranch remained steady, a living monument to redemption and the quiet strength of choosing to stay. Colt Mercer, now older and lined with the weather of time, still rode the fences every morning, his beard flecked with gray and his eyes sharper than ever, not from suspicion, but from wisdom earned through every burden carried and every truth faced head-on. The school had grown into 2 full buildings now, a second bell ringing for younger students, while the older ones helped repair stables and study under Willa, who had become something more than just a teacher. She was legend now, known across the territory as the woman who'd built scholars from runaways and healed hearts with algebra and empathy. She and Colt never married. There had been no vows, no rings, no porch proposal whispered under starlight, but theirs was a love rooted in something deeper than tradition. Shared battle, mutual belief, and mornings spent in quiet companionship. Every Friday, Colt would still bring out Madeline's journal, open it to a random page and read it aloud to the staff. "She wanted this," he'd say, voice a little gravel now, but still steady. Not the school, not the ranch. This. People rising. He kept the velvet room just as it was, dusted weekly, her portrait untouched, and the chest in the canyon vault remained sealed, its secrets no longer fuel for leverage, but compost for clarity. In town, the name Ironwood meant something different. Now not fear or whispered scandal, but hope. Children carried her name in notebooks and etched it into the school's wooden desks. One young boy, Jesse, who'd arrived barefoot and silent 5 winters ago, wrote a poem about her and won a contest judged by the mayor's wife. The bell over the school rang louder than ever, and sometimes people came from other counties just to hear it chime. Colt would watch them from the porch, a little amused, a little humbled, and when asked by reporters or curious drifters what the secret to his success was, he always gave the same answer: start with the truth. The rest is just weather. On the 20th anniversary of Madeline Ironwood's passing, the town gathered at the canyon where the willow tree still bent like an old dancer, its roots clutching the grave of the woman who had once ruled like a storm and died like a whisper. Colt gave a short speech, never was much for talk. He told them what she had left him and what he had done with it, and how sometimes the people with the darkest pasts are the ones who build the brightest futures. Willa placed the old silver wedding ring on a stone pedestal beside the tree, and the children placed flowers, each chosen from the school's garden, a patch Colt had started himself in her honor. That night, the ranch was filled with music for the first time in decades. Fiddles played, children danced, and even old. Amos tapped his boot. Colt sat under the stars sipping cider instead of wine, watching it all with a heart that had once been empty, but now overflowed. And as the firelight flickered across faces lit with joy and forgiveness, he felt her again, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a presence carried on every breeze that touched the land she once guarded with silence and thorns. He whispered, "Just once. You did good, Maddie. You found the right cowboy." The wind rustled the willow leaves in reply. Long after the fire died and the last note played, Colt remained on the porch, alone but never lonely. He had no son to pass the ranch to, no wife to kiss goodnight, but the legacy left in his care had been planted, nurtured, and set free. The Ironwood Ranch had become what Madeline could only dream of, a place where pain became purpose, where secrets became soil, and where a cowboy without a past built a future for everyone brave enough to start over. And in that final moment of quiet, as the stars blinked awake and the canyon sighed with the breath of old stories put to rest, Colt Mercer tipped his hat to the night, not to mourn what was gone, but to honor what